So the purposes of the guide, main reasons I wrote the guide. First off, just to isolate a collection of prominent excerpts from significant and frequently performed compositions for wind band. I've chosen 40 total in the paper, in the guide. I'm going to play 7 of them for you today. These range, when I say significant and frequently performed, these range from things like Lincolnshire Posy, Hindemith Symphony for Band, pieces that are played very often, to the more obscure pieces, William Craft, Dialogues and Entertainments, which definitely have an important timpani part. I think they say a lot about where the timpani has come, the way it's being written for, but not necessarily frequently performed. Still think it's an important piece for timpani. To provide an analysis of each excerpt, focusing on logistical and performance problems, preparation, practical advice to aid in the successful performance of each excerpt. So this is going to include translations, translation of foreign terms, mallet choice, definition of tempo and articulation markings, and some standard performance practices, wherever those are appropriate. To create an awareness of the timpanist's specific role in the wind band, so that timpanists can consider appropriate choices in order to perform each excerpt thoughtfully, musically, and as the composer intended. Now, granted, there's only 40 excerpts in here. There's not every band excerpt, but my goal is that I've offered enough choices and enough different ideas that if there's a piece that you're working on in band that's not in this guide, you can take some of the ideas that are in this guide and apply them to other things. And finally, this is sort of the secret weapon, is to offer useful resources for composers and conductors as well. So this is going to help, hopefully, create an awareness of the technical possibilities and demands placed on the timpanist. So for composers, this means a realization and an understanding that articulation and musicality are just as important or just as possible for the timpanist as they are for the wind player, which they definitely are, and to consider range and equipment limitations with regard to tone quality and musical intent. Basically, as a composer, if you're thinking, I wonder if it would be a good idea to copy the whole tuba part into the timpani part. Is that really going to get the effect you want? More on this later. For conductors, this means basically the same things, an awareness of the articulation and musical possibilities that are capable of being performed. I find a lot of times with non-percussion conductors, of course they're not as sure about mallet choices and they're not as aware that we definitely can do, and in the whole percussion section we can definitely do the articulations like a wind player can. A little differently, but we can still, I think, have the same goals or the same final outcome. All right, so in this guide, I've done a few things. I'm going to take you through, and you also have an example in your program, a page from the guide. This is a different one. So here's how my guide works. For every excerpt, there's 40 excerpts, not necessarily 40 pieces. They all have the bibliographic information with all the dates, the composer, and the score in which I used in study with these excerpts. I've also provided a recommended setup of drums to use, and this pertains not just to this excerpt, but for the whole piece. So for the whole Dionysiac, you need 2 32s, 29, 26, and a 23. I've pinpointed exactly where the excerpt comes from out of the part. This is the 3rd through 5th measures after rehearsal 6. Then I've provided the original excerpt just as it looks in the part. So if you had the part, that's exactly as you would see it. And my annotated version. More on this in a second. So my annotated version contains a few things, depending on the case. Translation of a foreign term. I've done all that in the annotation. As you see in the original, there's no tempo marking in that particular place in the music, so I've added tempo markings to make rehearsal easier. I've suggested which drums you should put different notes on. And then in this particular excerpt, I've actually changed up the articulation. And for every excerpt, there's a short narrative. In this case, since I changed the articulation, I've explained why. For instance, the timpanist is imitating the horns and euphoniums on da 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 da, and then doubling the tubas on di da. So I've matched the timpani I've made the timpani articulation match what the winds are playing. So the narrative explains why I've made the decisions I've made.